Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is a lecture and a continuing 9-part lecture series on Aristotle's virtue ethics. This lecture comes after the lecture on justice. And as you see here, justice was not originally planned, so this is technically the 6th lecture, even though it's labeled the 5th lecture. Before this, we also talked about eudaimonia, virtue and voluntary action, and after this, we'll talk about friendship, contemplation, and the intellectual virtues before we assess Aristotle's approach. So in his book on continence and incontinence, within the discussion of virtue, what he's talking about here are different conditions to be avoided. So the virtuous person wants to avoid or stay away from or have a character that does not have any of these issues. So continence, bestiality, and vice. Now we've already talked about vice as the opposite of virtue, virtue being a mean between two extremes. So bravery is a mean between rashness and cowardliness. So vice would qualify as either cowardliness or rashness, and virtue is the mean between those. What we want to do in this chapter is look at two other conditions to be avoided, which is bestiality and continence, and see how they differ from vice. So to begin with, we talk about bestiality here. And what Aristotle is really talking about is that which, makes us more like animals. It has no aspect of what the really human is here. So it contrasts with godliness. Now, again, Aristotle is not a Christian. He's writing before the Christian era. So when he's talking about godliness here, he's still talking about something important that later on influenced Christian ideas about God, but it's a sense of being divine, of having something eternal and good about oneself. That's important for Aristotle. So, of course, he says we don't expect the gods to be virtuous, and we should not expect the beast to be virtuous as well. So bestiality is less than human, whereas godliness, of course, is more than human. In the Politics, again, a different book that someday I might do a lecture series on, he says that the one who can live without society is either a beast or a god. So human beings need to live in society. We need society to help us develop our virtues, to practice the virtues, to learn, etc. And bestiality is something that's outside of society, that is really grounded in the lack of reason and acting like something without any kind of reasoning capacity for Aristotle. Incontinence, on the other hand, is something that one can fall into as a human being. And so we begin by contrasting the continent person from the incontinent person. So continence means that the person abides by his deliberation. So in our discussion of voluntary actions, we noted that voluntary actions arise from deliberation, involves a decision, and that it requires a certain capacity for reason here, right? So the continent person has deliberated, knows what the good is, and uses his or her virtues to pursue the good. So the continent person is resistant to things that might distract from the pursuit of the good. And the continent person is someone who's praiseworthy. This is someone we look up to and say, I want to be like that person. They have their life in shape, and I want to have my life in shape. The incontinent person, though, is one who seems like maybe they've deliberated, but they've abandoned the deliberation. They don't abide by their own decision making, and they do something completely off base. And so they become someone who's not praiseworthy, someone who is a base kind of person that we really don't want to be like that kind of person. Okay. Now, we want to make sure that we contrast the incontinent person from the intemperate person. So you might remember that temperance is a virtue for Aristotle. It's a virtue that deals with pleasures, so having the right amount of pleasures at the right time and the right way. An intemperate person then is someone who either doesn't have any joy in pleasures at all, or someone who just enjoys pleasures too much and eats too much chocolate cake, for instance. So an intemperate person is acting on decision, but she believes that the pleasures that she's pursuing are the right ones to pursue. The incontinent person, in contrast, is someone pursuing the wrong ends, right? They think that these are the wrong ends to pursue, and yet they pursue them anyway. So we might think about the alcoholic here. The alcoholic knows that drinking is a bad thing for him to do, and yet he does it anyway, despite knowing the difference there. So incontinence, at least in the way that I'm interpreting at this point, is the idea that there are some desires that, even though we've already made a decision not to pursue those desires, we still pursue those desires, and we know that we're wrong in doing it. Intemperance is we think that we're pursuing the right desires, and we're just on the wrong track here, right? We're pursuing too many or not enough. So continence, as a good person might have it, involves a knowledge, right? So there's moral arguments that lie behind the continent person's actions. And so when we think about a moral argument for Aristotle, we've already gone over this a little bit, but it's the idea that there's some kind of universal belief. This is good. And then a particular belief that whatever it is that we're talking about in the particular is this thing. And then that leads to an action. I'm going to pursue this thing. So we might say that honor is good. And if I go into battle and protect this person, then that would be honorable. And so therefore I go into battle and protect that person because that's what is good for me. So the example that I give here on the slide is being sober is a good. Drinking alcohol leads to drunkenness, therefore I shall avoid alcohol. Same sort of idea here. There's a universal belief, a particular belief, and then that leads to action. So for Aristotle, these sorts of arguments always lead to action. This is a little more advanced than we might see with Plato and Socrates. Plato, the idea is that as soon as you have knowledge, you act. Aristotle at least brings in the argument here in applying the knowledge to some extent. Not a big difference, but a minor difference that we might just keep in mind. The incontinent person, however, acts as though he does not know the particular, right? So if we go back to the argument about being sober is a good. Drinking alcohol does not mean insobriety. Therefore, I shall have alcohol, and I actually drink. And so here, the incontinent person is not recognizing that what he is doing is leading to the absence of the good, or is contrary to the good. So there's a problem in the way that the incontinent person is thinking, that the continent person does not have that struggle. Now, when we think about incontinence, there are two kinds here. There's simple and complex. These should be fairly simple, but just to go through them a little bit, the simple incontinent person is incontinent about necessary pleasures. So we all need food, drink, copulation, etc. But what happens is we have conflicts about our decisions over these pleasures. So I obviously need food, and I have a nice meal of drunken noodle chicken in front of me, and it's a big meal, and I eat it all when I should have only eaten half of it. That's the simple incontinence. The food is good, and I overreach there. The complex incontinent person, though, is one who's incontinent about pleasures that are maybe not choice-worthy. Pleasures that are choice-worthy in themselves. So honor, the example that I gave last time. So if you think about, if you're a Star Trek fan, the Klingons are trying to lead honorable lives here. And so they're not being vicious per se, but what they're doing is they're choosing something that's choice-worthy, but they're choosing too much of it. And so the Klingons get into fights when they don't need to. If you're not a fan of Star Trek, maybe you're familiar with How I Met Your Mother. Ted on there is someone who is pursuing love, which is a good, and yet he's so committed to this idea of the right person that he's going to meet that it really conflicts with him leading a happy life, as we see through 9 seasons of How I Met Your Mother. So continence is involving the kind of persons we are, the decisions that we make. It involves the deliberation and choice. Bestiality is different from that, right? Bestiality is about just following nature and not really having any choice, just pursuing like intense desires as if we're not even human anymore. So a big difference between the continent person who is recognizably human, but a base person, and the bestial person who is not recognizably. Well, actually, we wouldn't even say person. We would just say the bestial man or the bestial woman who simply lacks any kind of rational capacity there. Now, we've already talked about simple and complex incontinence. We can also talk about impetuosity and weakness. So, impetuosity is when we're led on by our feelings and we do not deliberate. So, if you recall Harry Potter book 5, and this is where Harry is struggling. He knows that Voldemort's back. No one believes him, and then he's getting lots of support from his godfather Sirius, and then he thinks Sirius is kidnapped. And Hermione says, how do you know they're not just leading you into a trap? You have this hero complex. And he still just charges on based on his feelings. And then when Sirius, sorry if I spoil the book for you, but when Sirius dies, he charges on forward and he uses one of the unforgivable curses. So here we have impetuosity. He's just simply driven by his emotions. Weakness, on the other hand, is when we deliberate, but then we abandon the result of our deliberation. So if you remember the Lord of the Rings, and Frodo is thinking about what he's going to do, how he's going to get the ring to Mordor, and he knows that he needs help to do this, and instead of sticking with a decision, he feels so abandoned, and he feels like he doesn't want to cause problems for his friends. He tries to leave on his own. And luckily, of course, Sam goes with him, finds out what's going on. But that's where we're too weak to stick to the kinds of feelings that we are the kinds of deliberations that we have. Now, incontinence is better than intemperance. The incontinent person regrets what he or she did, while the intemperate person will not regret it. So. The incontinent person knows that he's failing. He regrets that he's failing. The intemperate person doesn't realize that that's what's going on. Incontinence is not a device, for it doesn't come from deliberation, whereas the intemperate person ignores the first principle. The incontinent person is persuaded to follow them. So the intemperate person just says, these are not the right goods. The incontinent person says, these are the right goods. I just can't follow them. So for Aristotle, it's better to understand what the goods are and not be able to follow them, because that can be corrected easier than not recognizing what the goods actually are. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so we come to this idea. We come to the summary here. Bestiality is less than human. It doesn't require virtue to be beast. Incontinence is different from intemperance. We've talked about impetuosity and weakness. And the incontinent person is someone who regrets what she does. Of course, it's realizing that there is a mistake, that we have a problem, where we begin to make the change and seek help to solve that incontinence. And that's something that we've learned, in the centuries since following Aristotle. But he begins to at least distinguish for us the difference between incontinence and intemperance, and to point out that sometimes, even knowing what is the right thing to do, we don't follow what that right thing to do is. This later becomes known as the problem of weakness of will, which is a different discussion. But within the context of Aristotle's virtue ethics, we understand that Aristotle is aware that even when we try to be virtuous, sometimes we struggle to meet that. Thank you.